Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to see you all here for our webinar. We have the pleasure to present to you today Shelly Zer Zion from Israel. Our Israel Center has been established in 2013 with the aim to present the rich variety of Israel, of its society, of its history, of its culture, of its politics, and also, of course, of its research. And therefore, we are always happy to present to you speakers from Israel with interesting research projects, but also speakers from abroad who do interesting research on Israel. Tonight we have an Israeli speaker here, and I have the big pleasure that Brigitte Dallinger from Vienna University agreed to take over the introduction of our speaker and also to moderate the discussion that will follow Shelly's presentation. Brigitte Dallinger herself has been doing very interesting and important work on Jewish and particularly Yiddish theater in Vienna. She made an edition of an edition of sources for the history of the Jewish theater in Vienna, and she published books on Yiddish theater. She herself also has been active in theater, so she's very much connected with the topic that we are going to hear tonight. And so I won't keep you any longer, and I will ask Brigitte to start with the introduction of Shelley. And thank you, Shelley, for agreeing to come tonight.
Thank you, Noli, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this evening. I'm very interested in Shelley's studies. We met years ago. Last time we met for a short time on Zoom. We said it must have been about 16 years ago. And I also have to add my researches on Yiddish and Jewish theater are also more or less in the past, but still very interested in this topic. First, I will introduce you to Shelly Zer Zion. She is a senior lecturer at the Department of Theatre at the University of Haifa. Prior to this position, she was a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar at the NYU and the director of the Israeli Center for the Documentation of Performing Arts. Her research focuses on the history of modern Jewish theater in Hebrew and Yiddish and its role in the formation of the Jewish national culture. She published numerous articles on the subjects in journals such as the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies and Jewish Social Studies. She is also the author of the book Habima in Berlin, The Institutionalization of a Zionist Theater, published in 2015, and 1 year later the book was also translated in German, so you can also read it in German. And she's also the co-editor of the volume Habima, New Studies on National Theatre, published in 2017. Shelley, would you like to add something?
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you for inviting me and to let you know that it's a pleasure being here. And let us move to the PowerPoint presentation. Here it is. And let us start, well, with that. So, the theme of the lecture today is the Shtetl in Eretz-Israeli Theatre of the 1930s. And let me start with a citation from theater critic in the Shuv, Eugen Hoflich, Austrian originally, better known in Israeli context as Moshe Yaakov Ben Gavriel, and he published in Haaretz an essay about what Hebrew theater should be like. and I quote, "It should shape the nature of the future. This nature cannot derive from the spheres of the dibuk, only from the real state of the landscape, from the problems of building Zionism, and from those Hebrew historical chapters that can serve as an ideal." Well, so far sounds good, makes sense. This is all about Zionism, right? Building a new society, leaving the exilic past behind. This is what it should be. There is a minor problem, though. When we look at the repertory of the theaters that worked in the Yishuv, basically the repertory theaters Habima and the Oil, we see only 2 original theater productions that dealt with the landscape of the land and so on and on, and we see a whole number of productions, theater productions, dealing with the landscape of the Shtetl. Just to give you the Shtetl, its afterlife, is other Eastern European Jewish places connected with the Shtetl. I will just translate for those of you who do not read Hebrew. Travelers of Binyamin III, 2 productions, one of the Oil, one in Abima, Mirale Efres, Yoshe Kalb, Menachem Mendel, Him and His Son by Berkovich, The Broitmill by Bergelson, The People of Katzrilivka, Sholem Aleichem, Witchcraft Tale, Sholem Aleichem, and so on and on and on. And the question is, what is it doing there? How is it connected to the Zionist agenda of the Hebrew theater? Because there was a Zionist agenda to the Hebrew theater, this beyond any doubt. And 2 repertory theater companies that were working during the 1930s were utterly committed to the Zionist project. So why was the Shtetl so dominant? I would like to address this question by reading the images of the Shtetl as a metaphor, and to try to find out why was this metaphor so crucial. But before going into the thing itself, let us share the knowledge of what a Shtetl is. And the Shtetl has, it's a very important concept that has 2 histories. The first is the realistic history, the real history of the Shtetl. So the real history of the Shtetl is that it began during the 16th century as a kind of Jewish, a very significant Jewish settlement in the Kingdom of Poland. It was the small market towns that moderated between the local magnates and the villages, and small marketplaces. They were very significant in the economy, in the pre-modern, pre-industrial economy of Eastern Europe. And once this economy changed, they started to decline. So, and usually historians agree that there are like 3 waves of declining of the Shtetl. The first is took place during the second half of the 19th century after the Industrial Revolution. The second was during World War I, and the urbanization that followed, and the last one, final, was during the Holocaust. But the Shtetl has another history, which is its afterlife. A history as a cultural paradigm that started to flourish along with its first decline, and started to to flourish and to become very significant and inspiring cultural location from the 19th century onward till, if you want, Fiddler on the Roof, right? And this post-vernacular history is the one that we are talking of now. It was extremely important all over the Eastern European Jewish diaspora, or places that or Jewish population that related to that diaspora. So we can, the first discourse of the Shtetl could be seen in the early 19th century, late 18th century, in the German Jewish community, in which people immigrated from the Shtetl. It became a very central location in Germany by Buber and his Hasidic project, by authors, modernist Yiddish authors such as Sholem Aleichem, Peretz Mendele Moicher Sforim, the classic Yiddish authors, and the generation that followed, like Bergelson or Ash, or modernist authors. And it was a very powerful image. Dan Miron explains that it became a metaphor of Jewish life, and it was so central, especially because there is no one single unified identity of Jewish modernity. And this is why this shtetl was so important, because it was a kind of historical hub. It was a place that, a past place that constituted where we came from, and yet it was a kind of a hub, a place that you live, a place whose whole essence is comparative, right? The name shtetl is a comparative term. It's not a city, a Stadt, neither a village. It's something that you know that it's a little town just by living it. And I would like to show that the shtetl, actually in the Hebrew theater, it's a location that functions between two paradigms. The first is the more acceptable one, a diasporic, transnational model of peoplehood, not really of nationalism, not really Jewish nationalism, but a softer term of nationalism. A link between, a transnational link between the Jews of Eastern Europe. Peoplehood, I think it's a good word for that. On the other hand, there is another model of Zionist nationalism, which is Palestinocentric, and I would like to explore what kind of advantages does the model of peoplehood offers Zionism, and in what way the theater contributes and produces this additional layer of national belonging via the diasporic sense of peoplehood. So let us start, and let us go into 3 examples, and each of the examples I would like to stress something different. So the first would be the shtetl as a language and as a conceptual language, and I would like to talk about the Short Friday, a short play based on a joke by Chaim Nachman Bialik. So the story of Yom HaShishi HaKatzar, the Short Friday, begins as Habima wanted to make a play dedicated to Bialik to celebrate his 60th birthday, which was a very significant event of the Yishuv. Baruch Chemerinsky talked with Bialik, set an appointment, and they wanted to make a dramatization of the diligent Talmud student, Hamatamid. Bialik didn't like it at all, and he told me that the stage demands its own, and if you want to make an adaptation for the Jubilee event, you should make it cheerful, some singing, even dancing. You better choose one of my stories and stage it freely, something like a joke, say the Short Friday. And this is how this idea came to the world. Chemerinsky was terrified by adapting alone himself Bialik's Hebrew. And he, together with Reuven Rubin, the designer, decided to keep the whole concept of an adaptation of a story by Bialik as the central visual theme of this adaptation, this stage performance. As you can see, right, the scenery was constructed by a huge book that is Yom HaShishi HaKatzar by Bialik. We can see the Bialik's publishing house, Dvir, and it opens, and like a pop-up art, the different sceneries in the plot came out of the book. The story is a very significant, it's a small joke about Reb Lifa, who was invited to the Brit, to the circumcise of another friend of him, Reb Getzi, outside of the shtetl, in a wintry Friday. From the beginning, that Lifa decides to follow the invitation and to go with Ivan the Goy outside of the shtetl, begins a problematic chain of events that takes him out of the religious Jewish space and confronts, in which he confronts the elements of nature. The first, he gets drunk in the ceremony and leaves too late. Then he and Ivan get stuck in a snowstorm in the woods. Later on, Ivan takes, and night is falling, Shabbat is entering in the middle of the road. Ivan takes Lifa kicking and screaming to the tavern of another Jew, and he puts him there at night, and the poor Reb Lifa falls asleep. The tavern owner, as he sees the big rabbi sleeping on a bench, is sure that he miscalculated the days of the week, and now it is Sunday and not Saturday. He begins to make everything Sunday-ish, and then Reb Lifa is sure that he overslept the entire Shabbat, and they go back to the shtetl, and they rush into the shtetl, he and Ivan, the minute people are going out of the shul. End of story. It's a joke. According to Bialik, this joke, the joke captured the essence of the people's spirit. And I'll quote, "Indeed, there is nothing more than a light joke, but it is not to be taken lightly. Not everybody realizes the tremendous value of a joke in the history of literatures, and especially the folk joke, which is the foundation of all literatures. The people cannot commemorate great things. For these reasons, they reduce existence to very small things, and this is Proverbs. And these are the things encapsulating the spirit of the people. Namely, the joke is a language in itself. So we can see here two layers of language. The first was the language of the canonic literature, namely the Hebrew of Bialik, that was adapted to the performance, but then we can see also the spirit of the joke, of the people's joke that this play encapsulated. And in that respect, the concept of collecting the people's culture and gathering it is part of the Kinus project, a very significant project that in many respects Bialik was the high priest of this cultural Zionist project of collecting, assembling, translating and adapting the Hebrew cultural heritage into Hebrew and collecting it. And the audience was enthusiastic by this joke. They laughed at it, they identified themselves with it, and they laughed at the gesticulations of the actors, and you can see in the images here these gesticulations and their body language, which is something very tricky, right? They could identify everything about this joke. They could understand why it is funny, and yet they could distance themselves by it by making the people of the Shtetl the target for their laughter. So in that respect, it was both a mechanism of knowing this language, using this language of humor, and this humor worked even though not all of them mastered the kind of Hebrew Bialik had written, but then distancing themselves by laughing at what was presented and creating themselves as a new society, which is kind of modern Shtetl, very exclusively Jewish and Eastern European. Now let us move to the other example, the Shtetl as time. This time I want to talk about a fill string by Berkovich, an adaptation of Sholem Aleichem's short story. The premiere was in December 1935. You can see the theater program here, and it was created as a play for the entire family, namely a children play for Hanukkah. It was a play that ran in the Habima repertoire for about 30 years. So the plot has 3 locations. The story tells about Zemele, a young boy that desires to play the fiddle, to learn how to play the fiddle. His parents are less than keen about this new hobby of his, and they want to prevent him from doing that. They are the tavern keepers, and they're very pious and not interested in beautification of Jewish lives, very traditional, very conservative. The boy is attracted to the house of Naphtali, the poor klezmer with his many children, and to a Polish character, Chechik, the Kapellmeister, and the plot is moving between 3 locations: Chechik's manor, Naphtali's house, and the tavern of the parents. You can see that in the scenery, Immanuel Luftglas creating a scenery after a sketch by Chemerinsky, was the director of this play, of a huge drum in a revolving stage. So each time the drum opened differently to symbolize the different locations of the on the stage. And of course you can see in these images the tremendous influence of Chagall. Now just I'm showing you the murals of Introduction to Jewish Theatre from Moscow, 1922. It's a scenery that Chagall, it's part of a scenery that Chagall made to a performance of Moscow State Yiddish Theatre, which was a theatre, the fabulous Yiddish theatre that worked parallel to Habima in Moscow. And of course Chemerinsky knew that. Now, for the time, when we think about the time and how time functions in this play, it has something very interesting. First, the Shtetl was a location of nostalgia, and the actor himself, like many of the Abima actors and many of the audience, Avram Baratz was the actor who played Zemele. And these are all were Shtetl Jews. Shtetl Jews, for them, the Shtetl was a location of nostalgia and childhood memory. Yet talking about children in the Shtetl was more problematic than that, because children, especially in the work of Sholem Aleichem, carried within them the power of change and modernization, like the daughters in Tevye the Milchiger, right? But in that respect, it was a non-political change, which is the attraction to music. I'm quoting part of Naftali's monologue just to give you an impression of the power of music. The fiddle, do you hear, is the father of all music instruments of the world. The first fiddler in the world was Tubal Cain, or Metushelach. I no longer recall accurately. The second fiddler was King David, and there is the third fiddler. His name was Paganini, and he was also a Jew, which is like, no, he wasn't a Jew, but he passed as a Jew. All the best fiddlers in the world were Jewish descendants. For example, Stempenu, a figure in Sholem Aleichem novel Stempenu, Pedatzur, and others. And the music here has a diabolic nature associated with modernity, with steel, with Cain, right, with the invention of steel. And it's a desire to it's a modernist desire to beautify Jewish life. And in that respect, it is part of the future. And this part of the future was addressing the audience in Tel Aviv, in the new shtetl that could look back while looking at a performance that legitimizes the use of music, the use of art, and the very beautification of Jewish life. So in that respect, this essence of time created a very strong sense of success, leaving the shtetl, leaving the rigid norms of the shtetl behind, while creating a new shtetl, a new Jewish microcosm in Tel Aviv that is utterly Jewish, that speaks the cultural Jewish language, and yet manages to beautify Jewish life and to embrace modernity via art and via the new medium of communication like radio and so on that broadcast mostly music, as was the radio, the early radio of 1935 in Palestine. And now let us move to the third example, which is a space, and I want to talk about it in the travels of Binyamin III by Aaron Ashman after Mendelin Moichel's Sporim. Moshe, this production was staged in Oil Theatre, the Workers' Theatre, theatre affiliated with the Histadrut, and it was staged by Moshe Alevi. The set designer is Yitzhak Frenkel, and look how beautifully it starts also with the image of the book, right? And another, me with gesticulation doesn't really help. Let me use the mouse. So it's a book, an image of a book, and another Chagalian image of people floating on a bird. And Leah Goldberg, just a small quote, the book of childhood is opening for us. We are browsing in all that was dear to us from those days. The Shtetl with its hump-like houses, the wide, endless golden fields and with white poplar. And we can see this image here on the stage. So again, something we yearn for, and the image of the book. Two words about the plot. Binyamin lives in the town of Chaslon, and he ran into a messenger from Eretz-Israel who shows the figs of the land, and he desires to travel to Eretz-Israel. He takes Sandal the Roman with him, a small Jew battered by his wife, the essence of the effeminated Jew, and they go on a journey to travel to Eretz-Israel. Alas, they arrive only in the town nearby, and from there they return. So it's a failed journey. But then it's a with all its pathos, and it's very funny story. Again, the humor exists there. A brief example of how space functions here, we can see in one of the scenes right after they leave their shtetl, and they hit the road, and they are doing a small meal on the way. Let me read it very briefly, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. Sandal opens the backpack and occupies himself like a woman of valor as he takes out zucchini and radish and onions and garlic and slice of challah. Where do we take the water for netilat yadayim, to wash our hands? Binyamin: in times of distress, you fulfill the minimal obligations by rubbing your hands on a wood plank, and before us stands an entire tree. They rub their hands on a trunk of the shrubbery and say Asher Yatzar. They slice the bread and eat it with the vegetables. Binyamin: soon we shall eat the harvest of the land, figs and dates and carobs. The carobs are ubiquitous there. In those places, in the valley of Genosar, for example, the carobs grow as big as a towel, and they are softer than beeswax and sweeter than licorice. The goats eat them and fatten themselves, and the milk pours out of their breasts and flows like a river. And later on they pack and they bless Arachaman, grace after meal. So what do we see here? We see three layers of space. The first layer, which is the obvious one, is the utopian space, Eretz-Israel. And it's a kind of place, no place, right? Utopia is no place, this is no place, and they yearn for this imagined place. Then there is another place, the holy, dyadic place between them, which is the ritual of a traditional meal, a very domestic meal, yet the form domesticity, the dual, a pairing of two men, right? And the last one is what they are doing. They're in the middle of the way. They're on their way, so they are actually walking on a net between places, from one place to the other. So it's a kind of Jewish net between places. We can see that the entire story of this performance created a metaphor of a realistic net with all these three locations. First, it was performed in 1936 in the 100th jubilee year to the birth of Mendele Moichel Sforim. So the entire press was, there were reports about different places where it celebrated the work of Mendele. So we can see the net of this Eastern European Jewish diaspora in New York, in London, in Moscow, in Odessa, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in other places, all over. And then there is, I'll rush it through, and then there is desire of, while moving between this net of places, you can see that it's, you just move from one place to the other like a kind of migration in order to improve your position. And Moshe Halevi declared that he wanted to take hits of the Yiddish theater in order to improve the position of the theater and its financial status. So this cultural migration also has the same function. And yet there is another function of moving towards utopia. And this is the last citation that I bring. We can see it in a reference of one of the audience who saw this performance in the Israel Valley during the Arab revolts. In all the past months, we were focused on the nights and all that was going on around us, guarding the settlements, right? Disconnected from a play, from a concert, neither a bima nor the oil. And now the members of the oil perform for us again. And he talks about how enthusiastic he was about this performance, how many viewers came to see in Kfar Yechezkel this play. In elevating the characters of Benjamin and Seder into symbols, in contemplating the dream of redemption in the pale of the distant shtetls, in the longing and pining for the land of Israel that pass from one generation to the next. All this good acting captured the heart of the viewers and thrilled it, and a fateful bond between the Vale of Tears and the Valley of Israel attracted us to the play, whose staging was so human and relevant. So what we can see here is that the villages and the settlements of Emek Israel are just another provincial places that are a continuation of the provincial places of Eastern Europe on one hand, but on the other hand, they're on the way to redemption, right? They're on the way to utopia. And of course, the Valley of Genosar is much closer to a Valley of Israel than to the shtels of Eastern Europe. So in that respect, the spatial image enabled, on the one hand, a movement between net of Jewish places, a transnational net that maintained and recreated the Jewish canon and reinforced it and strengthened it as something you can rely on and create your own identity. But on the other hand, you're moving towards redemption while fulfilling this religious imagination via secularizing it in the land of Israel. So I think this is the different images of why the shtetl was so significant in theater of the 1930s. It enabled to deepen radical transformation. It enabled to embrace Zionism in a more continuous and harmonious way, and not so traumatic. It enabled to overcome the trauma of migration and the change of language, and it enabled to, in a way, eat the cake and have it, to participate in the Zionist revolution while maintaining a sense of pre-Zionist and non-Zionist sense of peoplehood, and to strengthen it as a mechanism of being affiliated to the new shtetls created in Palestine, in mandatory Palestine. This is it. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, and I'm moving back into
Thank you, Shelley, for this very, very nice and interesting paper. What I saw at first, sketches and stage designs and stage photos you had, it was very clear for me that it was really kind of a network, because the photos from Palestine from the 30s are looking very similar to the photos from Bucharest in the 30s, Vienna in the 30s, all this stage. It's really very, very interesting, I think. But before I stop to talk about history of Jewish theater, please let me know if you have questions. Maybe you write your name or just make this one, I don't know.
So I have a question. My name is Ilana Shapira. I was wondering, Shelley, I find your argument fascinating, especially the concept of building or creating, even if it's imaginary, a sense of peoplehood moving from the Shtetl to the Zionist project in Palestine, in mandatory Palestine. But I was wondering, where were the women? What happened? Yeah, I mean, it's a men's club, it seems to me. There are men who occupy themselves as women. I'm sorry.
It's theater, and in theater there were actresses. There were, like, Hannah Rovina was a very significant phenomenon, although she did not step into the role of a shtetl Jew until very late. She played the first, it's not really shtetl, but it's a very significant Eastern European role, only in the summer of 1939, when she took upon herself the role of Mira Le'efos, which was a tremendous hit. But before that, because the cultural value of these plays was questionable, she didn't step into it, and the word in these plays, she didn't participate in these plays. Meskin, which was a very important star, played in these plays. There were actresses, but there were no theater directors, no designers in the 1930s, and the actresses that were active both in Abima and the Ohel were overshadowed by Rovina. Certainly they were, although they were female roles in these plays and female actors. But Rovina joined in only later.
Yeah. Mr. Ash.
You're muted.
I have it, thank you. I already wrote my question in the chat. So these plays are apparently, I gather they were all staged in Yiddish, is that correct?
No,
Aha!
Oh, no,
That's the beginning.
no.
That's the beginning.
Oh, alas, no. They were staged only in Hebrew.
Ah, okay.
And
So that answers my second question. Right.
Yeah, so this is something very important is, and I want to elaborate a little bit more about that, because you can see the Eastern European Jewish society, especially the traditional Eastern European Jewish society, was at the least trilingual. The least. They spoke Yiddish, they prayed and conducted intellectual life in Hebrew, and they knew at least one language of the place, which is Russian, Polish, Ukraine, and in different places they knew more than one, you know, like it's a multi-ethnic pre-World War II Eastern Europe. So in that respect, this place created a mechanism that enabled to smoothly move from Yiddish into Hebrew in a more gentle way, because there were adaptations of adaptations of adaptations. Even Bialik's original Hebrew story was an adaptation of a known Yiddish joke that was already written and published. And even though the people, not all of them, most of them, did not master Hebrew, certainly not to the extent of the literary Hebrew of Bialik or Berkovich or even Ashman. Yet they knew the stories. And they could read the gesticulation, they could read the body language, and they knew the images, and they had the visual literacy to understand everything. And in that respect, it was a very important mechanism of being affiliated to the mass, to the hegemony culture, even without mastering Hebrew, consuming Hebrew culture without mastering it. And in that respect, the theater played a very significant role in creating this new language that was built upon the sense of peoplehood and the people's culture, while appropriating it to the Hebrew demands of Zionism. So it's very important in that respect.
Okay. Is it Luisa Hecht?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we also met years ago. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Shelley, for a fascinating lecture. I very much loved your way of deconstructing the myth of negating the diaspora by showing that actually they continued the diaspora by forging with the Shtetl a new national identity. Is this what you intended?
Yes.
I think it's just extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I would have a question, and it comes from thinking about theater in general, because couldn't it also be that this Yiddish, which was the foundation of these Hebrew translations, yes, that was a place the people knew. They knew how to act it, yes, and maybe there was also a lack on modern Hebrew plays. So this was a kind of basic foundations of plays. The theaters just could deal with it. I think, could it not have also very, very pragmatische reasons, yeah, practical to go to this place and translate them and put them on stage, yeah.
But I think that the dislocation of the shell was more than being pragmatic. for two reasons. First, there were Hebrew plays. They just didn't perform them. They were, and these plays were excellent. They were plays by Brenner and plays by Orlov, and very refined, very modernist plays. And there were also plays by Ashman himself. So there were plays, though they chose not to perform them, and they clang into the landscape of the Yiddish. And then when we look on the Yiddish repertory, there were other plays. There were plays like Sholem Asch's plays, or even plays by Peretz, or I don't know, Leivik, who didn't take place in the Shtetl, or even Mirle Efros, the big Mirle Efros, that they came to perform it only on the eve of the war, right? As it was certain that war is about to happen, and the Jews of Poland are in great distress. Nobody knew what will happen, but you know, they were very positive that something very bad is about to happen. So there was something more into it, and I think it has to do with the metaphoric layer of the Shtetl. And I think that later on we can see that this metaphoric layer takes another turn during the 1948 generation of the first Israeli playwrights who locate this new shtetl in the kibbutz. It's a metaphoric location that encapsulates the new Jewish, the new pre-revolutionary or revolutionary Jewish experience, and it's a small place. It's a kind of microcosm. It offers a very specific identity and a very specific link to the past. So in that respect, it's not only for practical reasons. This is at least what I think.
Not only, but I could imagine it plays a certain role in it.
Definitely.
Yes. Also for the acting style.
Definitely.
Because you can see the stage signs and how the people act and how they are acting. It's definitely like in Eastern Europe, Western Europe in the 30s.
Definitely.
In the Yiddish
Definitely.
theater.
It's another layer. It's another layer. I definitely agree that it has also to do with the mutual culture. The culture is bilanguage, and I think you cannot differentiate between the revolution of the art theater in Yiddish to Hebrew. It's the revolution of the birth of Jewish art theater, and it takes place in both languages.
Eva?
Eva?
I like also, I mean, there are several points that you made that I thought that were really very interesting. One was the idea of the language and the book and the words, and what happens to the words in the background. It's like a kind of a joke and a tribute to a person and to a creative person. And in this regard, you spoke about continuity, a language continuity that transforms itself in Israel or in Palestine at the time. So they used the book as a kind of a symbolic transition between the past and the present and the background of a history. Like the book is a security that there is a kind of a continuation with Bialik. This was very interesting, I thought. I also thought that the space issue was interesting in regard to because it somehow, you know, it's a kind of a circulating movement that you showed us that leads nowhere. Or was it my impression that it was a circulating movement that was continuing? And I was wondering, because there's something that also, when I read your essay, I was wondering about, we grew up, I mean, much later, with a very strong sense coming from our parents and those who came from Poland, that the shtetl is a negative identification. It's a negative. Oh, the Jewish shtetl. We are out of the Jewish shtetl. Now we have a country. So is this development? Did it develop later on after the foundation of Israel, or was it in the 1930s? Because I thought there was a wish, especially in Europe, in the Western Eastern conflict. There was a wish to kind of reject the shtetl, the Eastern European image of the Jews, the Eastern European places, the run-down places. And I thought this came up also, maybe it came up with the Yekes? I don't know, maybe.
My hypothesis is that it was simultaneously. That there was the Zionist, I'm not saying in any way that the Zionist narrative of negating the diaspora and the anti-exilic ideology did not exist. It exists, and it was there. But what I'm trying to point is at another level that took place simultaneously, of creating the sense of peoplehood that was not totally fitting with the Zionist Palestinocentric negating of diaspora demands. And I think that we can see these two layers, at least, I think that you can see them at least till the 1960s in Matzitzim, when they talk Yiddish suddenly in Matzitzim, which is like the epitome of Israeli high rock culture of the 1960s. But then this layer of continuity exists as a joke, as something not really serious, but it's there. And I think that what I'm trying to see or to explore are the movement between two national movements. The one which is very clear, the Zionist one, but another one which is not, it's not necessarily Zionist, it's not necessarily not Zionist, it just does not play by these rules. It's just another one of, like making people want to circulate successful Jewish culture in order to improve the position of the theater, that makes the Jews of Palestine, some of them wish to or even immigrate to other Jewish locations such as the United States, that continues to operate there in the background. And it was active there along with the hegemonic Zionist model. It's not really, it does not really subvert it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. These are two models, and they have all kind of relationship between themselves.
Eva.
Okay,
please.
So I'm very anxious. I was fascinated by your presentation. I'm so excited. And back in 2006, I attended a book presentation at Central European University in Budapest, where I'm based. I'm based in Budapest, but I'm from Transylvania. I was fascinated by that book presentation because it was about this book.
Mm-hmm. Could you translate it?
Yes, it's Yehuda Koren Eilat Negev. We were giants in our souls. It's a story of a Lilliput theater company. They are all dwarves. The whole family was dwarves, and they survived Auschwitz because they had a very strong family relationship, and they were playing theater. And that's how they survived. It's a fascinating book, and I wrote a book review about it. And I'm wondering if you know this book.
No, not at all. It sounds fascinating.
Yes, and I strongly recommend it to you. And maybe you can read it in Hebrew, because originally was published in Jewish, I suppose. It's a Hungarian translation, and I wrote a book review about it, and I can send you my book review. Unfortunately, I wrote it in Hungarian, but I can translate it for you into English. So,
I would love that. Thank you very much.
And when they survived Auschwitz, they moved to Israel, and they continued this lifestyle, but not in form of a theater, but they were running a movie.
Interesting.
Yes,
I was not familiar with that. It's
this
very
is an
interesting.
amazing book and amazing survival strategy. You know how
Yes.
family strength. The key to survival for them was to get together, to stuck together and help each other, and not separate from each other. They always acted as one family.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Thank
So I
you.
strongly recommend. And the other question is, are you familiar with Maya Morgenstern performances? She is an actress from Bucharest, and she is, again, a fascinating
No,
actress.
unfortunately, I'm not.
Okay, because I'm from Romania originally, I can provide, because I'm fascinated by the richness of your research and the broad, you have a broad overview about this theater. So I think that these items should be included in your research. So that,
Gladly.
I will text you when. And
Wonderful. I'm very grateful.
And the third question is whether this is recorded, and can I watch it later on back and think about it, or show to my students, or what?
Dina?
Yes.
Yes, and is it accepted?
It's recorded, and we have a YouTube channel, the Center for Israel Studies Vienna. You can find it online, and also you can find our other lectures that also might be some source of inspiration for you. But yes, definitely.
Yes, great. Because not many years ago, I was involved in Holocaust research, and I wrote something about art and Holocaust, how Holocaust appears in literature and in fine arts. So I'm interested in your culture anyway. So Budapest and Vienna are not that far, so I can reach you. Thank you.
If you are interested in that subject, we had Anat Gilboa with us last year for a lecture also on the Holocaust and art, so I can connect you if you wish to.
Yes, definitely. I'm very, very interested, because I'm interested in this philosophy of productive suffering. How suffering and pain can be transferred into something valuable and productive. How does it appear in art? So I'm very much concerned about this.
Can I say something, Eva? I think what you pointed out before is interesting. From the last thing you pointed out about the Holocaust, and I mean, a bit this taking it far away, because in 1930s nobody knew about the Holocaust, but they did know about the persecution in Germany, 1933, and it may have been. And in Tel Aviv, I think there was a kind of a tension between the Yekkes and the new Yekkes and the Polish. There was a kind of a cultural conflict. So this could it be that? So this is one aspect. And then I would say, could it be that it was a kind of an assertion of a cultural identity against the newcomers? against the Yekis that were coming and changing the face of the culture in Tel Aviv. This would be one. And then in regard to your the historical part that you mentioned at the beginning about the 3 stages in which the shtetl became a history, like a disappearing shtetl, could it be, so the perspective would be reviving the shtetl as kind of reviving the world that is not there anymore, even though nobody knew that it will finish after the Holocaust. But this like 2 perspectives. One is the cultural conflict in Tel Aviv, Polish, German.
One more remark, if you allow me, because you raised this gender issue in relation with theater and performance, to show you that in this Lilliput theater, the majority of there were sisters, and the only giant person in the family was a male. You see, and these the main orchestrator of this theater was a strong woman character. You see.
Interesting. Ilana, the theater, the hegemony of the theater was Russian, not Polish. It's Russian, you know, like speaking of Eastern Europe, it's a Russian. It's a kind of Russian, right? Because they came from the Pale. They came. Most of the Abima actors came from the Shtetls of the Pale, and they moved to. Yes, so Zhitomir. Yes, it's the Shtetls of the Pale, and from there they immigrated to Moscow. And the oil also was founded by veterans of Abima. The Polish Jews were like the 4th Aliyah, and the Yekas were different and were, of course, not very well accepted. They were accepted, or their greatest imprints were in fields that were not occupied by Eastern European Jews, which is the architecture, museology, and things like that. The reference in the theater to the German Jewish culture is interesting, though it's somewhat different than the reference to the shtetl. It's more of a desired image of Europe. The desired, and then the tragedy of achieving this culture. It's a failed effort. So it's a tragedy of a failed effort. In plays like Yud Zeus that was performed in Abima in 1933, or Professor Mamlok, which is pseudonym of Professor Mannheim, Friedrich Wolf's Professor Mannheim, and even The Merchant of Venice, which was a very German created work that was staged by Leopold Jesner in Abima. So it's a kind of different narrative. But yeah, it's very distinct, and it's interesting that the Yekas represented for the issue the desired European/universal culture that one should aspire to.
I'm sorry that I don't want to dominate this evening, but I must tell you something that is important. That I wrote also a critique about performance many years ago. The actress was from Zagreb, I think, and she performed something about the books, and it was a solo performance, but these D-books came back in her vision, and she performed all the roles of different D-books, which was fascinating. And I was so touched by it that I had to write, a critique. I can send it over to you. That play also, and the actress name, she was fascinating.
Wonderful. I would love that. Thank you.
And the last remark, then I disappear from the scene. That did you know that there is a fascinating perfume called the Merchant of Venice? It's an Italian product, and when I tried this perfume 2 years ago, I participated in a conference in Malaysia, and I was walking around the marketplace, and all these fragrances came back smelling this perfume. And it turned out that the origin of these scents are from Malaysia, India, exactly the marketplace where I was wandering around.
Wow.
But it's very, very expensive and very good product.
Wow, that's amazing.
Very nice.
Strongly recommend you to try Merchant of Venice.
And I would never have imagined to try to Google the Merchant of Venice with perfume.
No, but even the design of the box is a piece of
I'm
art.
going to look for it.
Okay.
It's amazing.
Yes. And it's so Jewish and so wonderful.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I've had my hand raised for so long, so polite, but I think you can't see me.
I didn't see you, sorry. I really did not see it.
No
And
problem.
then we have Taron. Okay, after you, sorry.
I've had internet interruptions, but I heard something fascinating about a theater of the Histadrut that you mentioned, and then I was off. So maybe you can repeat and tell me a little bit about the content. Was it socialistic content?
This is one of the issues in this paper. Well, a word about the theater. In the issue there were three steady companies, theater companies. The most important was Abima, who settled in mandatory Palestine in 1931. It came to Palestine, stayed in Palestine, came for a long visit from 1927 till 1929, and back permanently in 1931. The other theater company is the Oel, which was a theater company affiliated with the Histadrut. It's very unclear how exactly it was affiliated with the Histadrut. The Histadrut supported the Oel and sometimes tried to intervene with the contents, non-successfully, but it was kind of love-hate relationship, and then they moved back and didn't really want to be involved in the theater and didn't want to sponsor them, and they demanded to the actors that should perform. They had performance duties in settlements in the province of Israel, of Palestine. So it was kind of problematic relationship, but it was affiliated with the Histadrut. And the third theater, of which I did not speak this time, was the Metaphoric, which was the Eretz-Israeli Theatrical Theatre, and also functioned from it was active from 1928 till 1953 continuously. And the Oel was from 1925 till 1969. So there were very stable, very significant, important theater companies. So this is the story of the Oel, and it's interesting to how extent there was a socialist plays or repertory there. There was something, although not very specific. It was the theater that played the socialist German hits. It put on Threepenny Opera, the Brave Soldat Schweig, Lilium, Friedrich Lobe, the husband of Mira Lobe, was a director there for 17 years. So in that respect, it was a branch of the German socialism. There was a very interesting attempt to put on a play by Bergelsson, the flour mill, the Breut mill. It caused such a scandal that it made Berl Katzenelson disconnect all his relationship with the Ohel, and the Histadrut to almost cause a financial catastrophe to the Ohel. So that was the only attempt that I know of to put on a Yiddish play by a Jewish communist. Very unsuccessful experience. So it was an interesting dance, though. You know, what kind of socialism do we allow to put on? No Toller, for example. No plays by Ernst Toller. I don't know, maybe because he was too Jewish.
But what about Matate? Did they also have some kind of niche or?
Mostly original plays, satirical reviews. They were the theater that enabled most of the actors who came from Germany to enter their company. It was not so closed for German Jewish theater people, and this is why they were the first theater to put on plays by Sami Gronemann, and they were the first. It was the first company to employ German Jewish actors and so on. So they were, you know, less canonic, desto more open.
Last question: did they survive? Oil and Matate, of course, Bima, and we all know about, but Matate and Oil, did they? What do they exist still in some other?
No, but they survived to the state era. The Oil was closed in 1969. So we are talking about a company that was active for more than 40 years, and it's a lot. And the Matate, it survived till 1953, which is also quite a lot for a satirical theater. It's a theater obliged to create a satirical each year 4 new satirical programs. So it's quite impressive.
Thank you.
Please, Doron, I think now it's time for your question.
I want to ask, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. And I wanted to ask you about the ambivalence, because I think that this ambivalence towards the Shtetl you can find also in other circumstances. I remember, for instance, Josef Roth, Juden auf Wanderschaft, the Wandering Jew. Yeah. But in the same time, also the Shtetl, how it is performed and perceived in the States, in the film, in the movies, in the Yiddish movies.
Yes.
And I wonder, and by the way, later there is also a Yiddish theater in Israel from Shmuel Atzmon, where you also have this romanticistic longing and rejection in itself, in the same time. But how did they know? Did they think about those American films? Did they know about that? Did they know about the other other dramatic.
Good question. It's a very good and interesting question. I don't have a very clear answer. Well, of course, I must first I must say that you're right. You're talking about the metaphoric post-vernacular, as Jeffrey Chandler's put it, history of the shtetl, and it's very interesting to look at Chandler's book, how he reads the shtetl into Polish Jewish culture, American Jewish culture, German Jewish culture, everything but Zionist Israeli culture, but it exists there as well. And of course, you're right, it's part of a larger phenomena of this post-shtetl cultural net. As for the American Jewish culture, it's interesting. There were connections with Morris Schwartz, for example, who was like the leading figure of Yiddish theater during the 1920s. He came to stage plays in the Oil. He staged in the Oil in the late 30s, Yoshe Kalb and brothers Ashkenazi of the Zingers. And another significant event in that respect is the performance of Mira Le'efros. But in Mira Le'efros, the American link is kind of weaker. They identify, the critics in Palestine identify Mira Le'efros with Esther Rochel Kaminska and with the Yiddish Warsaw theater culture, and not with the American Yiddish theater culture. Only one theater critic of the about 10 who had written about it mentions Kenny Liptzin and the American theater scene. As for Morris Schwartz, it's interesting because it's kind of fragmentary, right? It's the Americans it's an American Yiddish director whose greatest hit is Yoshe Kalb, and then he came to Palestine to put it in Hebrew because it is a great hit. But the story is about an Eastern European Shtetl, so it's kind of fragmentary. But I think the most interesting fact is to look at this net, to look at this networking and to see that it exists and it is powerful and it is vivid and it creates a very productive cultural scene. This, for me, it is the most important thing of all.
Thank you.
It's also very interesting that this film, like the book, was made, I think, in 1936, 1937, and also Jedel mit dem Fiddle. So these films were these pictures of images of shtetls.
Yes.
Are very, very strong and very impressive.
Definitely. Yes.
Same time as the place, yes, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of the network also.
Yeah, definitely. That's the network. That's the
Yeah,
continuation of this.
Yeah, it's just another media.
In two promised countries, right?
Yeah, I think it's what I'm trying to do is to read Jewish nationalism and Jewish Eretz-Israeli nationalism via a transnational net and not via the Zionist paradigm. This is what, interests me, is to see how this net works.
I think that's a very, very interesting side you take, yes. Very interesting perspective you take, and I'm sure that will Now I can find the right words. I'm sure that you will find new perspectives and layers of all these very connected Yiddish theaters and artists, and also then in Hebrew, yeah, and Zionist perspectives.
But didn't Chaim Nachman Bialik match the two together very well?
In what
This
way?
was his role, to match the diaspora and the new Zionists, because when he interviews people, he speaks, what do you think about the Palestinian aesthetics? You know, for him it's important to see something new is growing in Israel. It's also his house as a salon element, his whole center, cultural center. I mean, he embodied it in a way, no? That is the new beginning of a new culture.
It's interesting when you think about, you know, when you think about the aesthetic of Bialik's house and these oriental images all over the place in the spirit of this early Bezalel. It's really interesting to see how he captures it all in his, you know, both in his poetics and in his public public persona, which plays also a very significant role in that. It's not only his work, but he himself was his work, his own work art. Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Oh.
Myself. Okay, so did I unmute? Did I unmute?
Yes, you did.
Say one thing. Toda rabba.
Toda rabba to all of you. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Are you staying a bit longer? Okay. Oh, Shelley תישארי קצת יותר. אני אתפוס את השיחה. Yeah.
תודה רבה וערב טוב.
Thank you, Shelley Zer
ביי
Zion.
נענה, טוב לראות אותך.
Bye.
Very
So
much.
I'm staying.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, for moderating it. Thank you, Shelley.
My pleasure. Thank you, Shelley, for the evening.
Motek Shelley.
Thank you so much.
Motek Shelley.
I will send out the link of the lecture on YouTube, and you can see it and you can watch it again. And
Thank you.
wishing you all the best. Stay
Thank
healthy
you.
and safe. And
It was
thank you for our
fascinating.
next lecture.
Thank
It will be in March.
Thank
you.
Bye.
תודה רבה.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye. Brigitte, thank you much.
Oh, it was very interesting for me too. So I enjoyed it, yes. So, but have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.